I'm Ray Lauk. I'm the superintendent of a suburban Chicago school district and also an adjunct professor of school finance at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and also at Concordia University in Chicago. I've made this series of videos for my students who sometimes have to miss a class or a topic so they can go back and review those areas, but also it's really intended for school board members or other members of the public who just want a general understanding of how we fund schools in Illinois and what the issues are at state, local, and federal funding levels. It is intended to be kind of conversational, high level, but very concrete so that you have a clear understanding of where your tax dollars are going and how your schools are funded. This is not intended to be a deep, highly detailed orientation for people going for their chief school business official certificate. It's really intended for just average taxpayers who want a better idea of how their tax dollars are being spent in schools and how to really understand how their schools are being funded. So, in this first video, I want to address two issues. The first is kind of my perspective or my bias about how we fund schools and the fact that I think we need to really reframe or take a different look at how we fund schools, specifically how we spend money in schools. We have very little power over our revenue base. There's very little that we can do, very little discretion. We get what we get. The real discretion that we have in schools, though, is how we spend money. And I think that we need to spend money differently. And I think there's a case, a good research-based case, for spending money differently in schools. The second part that we'll get to is also what the values are in education and what those values are that we base decisions on how we're going to spend money in schools. So the first issue that we'll start with is the case for reframing educational finance. In schools across the country, we have an achievement gap. It's a chronic, persistent problem. The fact that white students achieve at a higher level, on average, than Hispanic students and African American students is criminal. It's an issue that exists in this country. It's, I believe, a civil rights issue, but it's one that we really haven't been willing to address. No Child Left Behind has really forced us to look at the issue, the fact that there is this achievement gap. And there are a lot of people who don't believe that 100% of students will meet or exceed state standards and expectations. And that's been one of the criticisms of No Child Left Behind. I happen to like it because of the fact that it has exposed the fact that we have this achievement gap. That for no good reason, there are different groups of students achieving at different levels. And the only reason that it exists is because we allow it to exist. That's it. That's the only reason. I have a standard response when colleagues or other educators will say, you know, Ray, with this No Child Left Behind, you don't really believe that 100% of students are going to meet or exceed expectations by the year 2014, do you? And so I ask, well, what are the names of the students that you're willing to fail? Because I want to know if my kids' names are on those lists. And typically it's not the names of white children, of white middle-class children. Typically the names that appear on that list of students that we are willing to fail tend to be children with Hispanic surnames, African Americans, and low-income children. Children who come from poverty. The ones that we're willing, unconsciously or subconsciously, the fact is we're willing to let them fail. When we say that 100% of students will not achieve, will not meet or exceed expectations. So we need to look at the research on the achievement gap. The very best source for this research is Understanding and Closing Achievement Gaps by Professor Joseph Murphy. Joe Murphy is a professor at Vanderbilt University, and he was one of my professors at the University of Illinois in Urbana back in the 80s. I believe Joe is the leading expert on the achievement gap, and his book is the main source of research on understanding the achievement gap and understanding what we have to do to really address this issue if we're going to be serious about it. So I want to take just a high-level look at the research in Joe's book and also from a presentation that he gave to some educators in the Chicago area, and just give a little overview, because the way we will close the achievement gap is by spending money differently in schools, if we're serious about that. So let's start off with the achievement gap. If you look at any of the indicators, all of the indicators of school success, the NAEP exam, if you look at AP exams, SAT tests, ACTs, college completion, high school completion, dropout rates, all of these show that there has been a very long-standing, chronic, persistent achievement gap between white subgroups and minority, African American and Hispanic subgroups. Underlying all of this, really, as I understand it, is really not just a racial divide, it's a poverty issue. And that the cause of the achievement gap is poverty. Now, schools could argue we don't control income levels. That's true. But the fact is that students come into school on the first day of kindergarten and there exists an achievement gap. We know this from research. First day of kindergarten, there's an achievement gap. The day they walk into school, before instruction has ever begun, there is an achievement gap. But what's troubling is that the longer kids are with us, the more they are in school, at a time when you would expect that the achievement gap closes, it actually widens. So the longer they're with us, the greater the gap grows. We need to do some things differently. We need to look at how we spend differently. Too often, too many schools simply take a line item, a budgeted amount, and say, well, since we spent this amount of money this year, next year we'll just bump that up by 3% or 5%. That really isn't a very conscious, very thoughtful way of budgeting, but you would be surprised how many schools actually do that and just bump up budgets a little bit without really thinking what's going into those decisions. Why are those dollars still being distributed in that fashion? This becomes a tricky political issue, because if we are going to solve the achievement gap, if we're going to close this achievement gap and expect all students to be successful at high levels, then we need to wrap those children around highly effective, research-based programs that will help raise their achievement. But to do that, we have to shift some dollars. And by shifting, that means some programs and some people are going to get less. There will be few dollars going to other areas that have traditionally gotten those resources as we move them towards other underfunded areas to bring greater numbers of interventions to kids who need them the most. Now, why is this issue even important? There are really two sides to this. There's the individual side, the fact that children are not achieving at levels that they could be and should be. But there's also a second side that we're starting to recognize, and Joe's work in this really highlights the fact that as a society and a country, there's a huge cost, there's a huge toll to this achievement gap that we're experiencing. It's draining our economy. First, let's talk about the individual educational attainment issues. We know that students who are on the wrong side of the achievement gap have an increased chance of falling behind in school. There's a higher dropout rate. They have a reduced enrollment in college. There's less likelihood of finishing college and getting that college degree. Now we're seeing, as students leave school, that gap has an impact on their lifetime earnings as well, that they have limited career path options, that there are concentrations in low-paying positions, low-paying jobs. So the achievement gap has an impact while kids are in school, but it's also a lifetime impediment. It's a lifetime disadvantage of being on that wrong side of the achievement gap. But now take a look at it from a societal standpoint too. We know that as a country, when we have children, entire groups of children, entire subgroups of children who are not achieving at the levels that they could be and should be, that there is reduced economic competitiveness across the country. There's a lower standard of living. There's a real impediment to productivity and performance, and a contribution to just a general decline in economic health. So we're starting to recognize the fact that this gap has shifted from being an indicator of educational inequality to being a direct cause of socioeconomic inequality. As I said, by and large, schools don't cause the achievement gap, but the longer they're with us, the gap widens, and that should trouble everyone. So while schools haven't caused the achievement gap, because of the resources available to us, because of the knowledge that we bring to the issue, we have a huge part to play in this. And it all comes down to how we fund schools. How we fund schools and about our beliefs about children and their ability to learn. So schools, unfortunately, have not been particularly successful in achieving the gap, to say the least. And some of the reasons for that are because it's really been a long-standing problem, but historically it just hasn't been a front burner issue. We haven't had the willingness to see this as an ethical issue, as a fairness issue to kids who are on the wrong side of the achievement gap. I don't think we've really seen it as a civil rights issue, and I would argue this is perhaps the greatest civil rights issue of our time right now. And sadly, we've just had a reluctance to reset priorities and reallocate resources. And that's what it comes down to. It takes courage to do that. Now, for those children who come from poverty, who don't have the benefits and the advantages that growing up wealthy brings, those children are highly school dependent. And what that means is that for their success in life, they really depend on what happens in school. They're highly school dependent. So what we do in school every single day matters highly to them. And the challenge that that brings to schools is that when schools get it right, when we really get instruction right, when we do right to these kids, they thrive. The flip side of that, though, is that when schools get it wrong and we just do a bad job, kids suffer. School-dependent kids suffer greatly. If you come from wealth and great material resources, you are less school-dependent, and your success is less directly driven by what happens on a day-to-day basis in school. So in schools that are in high poverty areas, such as mine, we've got to get it right, because kids only have one chance at it. And it's got to occur earlier than later, because earlier interventions will always trump trying to fix the problem later. Joe is fond of saying, the place to solve the high school achievement gap, it's in preschool, it's early childhood. We've got to look at closing that gap earlier. So that achievement gap and the fact that it exists, and the fact that I believe it's a civil right, civil rights issue, is the reason that I think we really need to look at how we allocate resources in schools. The starting point is understanding how we allocate resources in particular ways and why we allocate resources in particular ways. Now, I already told you sort of the political answer, in that oftentimes we do budgeting from one year to the next in unthinking ways, where we just bump up budgets by a random number just because it doesn't take a lot of thought and it's quick and dirty and it's easy. But we really need to think carefully how we make those decisions. Over time, there have been really 4 values in education. And this is not theoretical at all. You will find that school funding decisions get made based on one or more of these values. And they're very real, they're very alive values. The first one is adequacy. We have to make a decision. What is minimally adequate for an education in Illinois and in every state? And basically that's talking about what the floor is. How low do we go? What is the minimum that we expect, that we're willing to pay for? In Illinois, we have said that the minimally adequate education costs $6,119 combined between state and local resources. $6,119. And it's stayed that way for several years now. Now, one might think that we have scientifically gathered all of the numbers and all of the expenditures and taken cost of living variations across the state and determined that that is what the number is, and that is what the actual cost of a minimally adequate education is. Unfortunately, as I tell my students, the answer to 99% of school funding questions, the answer is politics. And politics explains why we've arrived at that adequacy figure, that $6,119. Basically, the state has decided what the pot of money is that's going to go to education. And that pot of money simply gets divided by the number of students in Illinois in in K-12 education. And that's how we've arrived, basically, at $6,119. But that's the first value of adequacy. Adequacy, what's minimally adequate. The second value that is very much alive in school funding debates and in school funding issues is equity. Equity is not the same as equal. The only thing that equity and equal have in common are the first 3 letters. That's it. Equity has to do with what's fair. So if students come into school with backgrounds that are not as enriched as other students, is it fair to spend the same amount of money on them, on all students? I would argue it's not. And what the arguments tend to be for when we argue equity is that if a student comes into school further behind than a more advantaged student, then we need to wrap that student with other interventions, with other programs to fill in those gaps. That means we will be spending more money on some students than others. That's an equity issue because of fairness. Now, it can go both ways, but that's the value. So you'll hear adequacy of what the minimum is, that we should be spending. Equity of what's fair across a state, across a district, across the country. And then the next value that we haven't heard so much about now, it was more popular, I'd say 20 years ago, is excellence. If we talk about the value of adequacy as setting the floor, some communities that have greater resources will talk about putting more money into certain programs because of excellence, because they want to talk about the sky, having high hopes, having high aspirations. And in high property wealth districts, they can do that because they have the resources. The low property wealth districts just don't have. And that with that $6,119, they just won't ever have. So high wealth districts can argue excellence as a rationalization, as the justification for spending more money on other programs, gifted programs, college advanced placement programs, AP programs, things like that. The fourth value that we've heard a lot about since the mid-1990s, again, it's a political value, but that's choice. And since we've seen the advent of charter schools and contract schools and real competition in public education, parents have wanted the value of choice. They wanted an alternative to public education. So, while previous to the 90s, the only competition to public education, and it was real competition too, was really homeschoolers, this invisible amount of students that were, we had 1 million students in the early 90s that were being homeschooled. That was really the only alternative that parents had, aside from a parochial education, Catholic or Lutheran school, private school education. But now we have a public school choice to many, generally urban school districts, and that is charter schools. Even though charter schools haven't been able to show great results, they're kind of on a par with public school results, but still parents feel that for various reasons they want a choice. So that's been the political value. So those are the 4 values: adequacy, equity, excellence, and choice. Those are the 4 values that have really driven school funding decisions. I think in the next video we'll start to get into the actual school budget and how to start looking at doing an analysis of a school's finances, school district's finances, and being able to do a pretty quick analysis of a school district's financial health.